So great to have you all here with us, and a very warm welcome to today's virtual workshop on exploring a circular economy strategy for Canada, which is an event that is being co-hosted today by Circular Economy Leadership Canada, or CELC, and the Smart Prosperity Institute, with support from Environment and Climate Change Canada. My name is Paul Shorthouse. I'm the Managing Director of CELC, and I'll be your host for today's virtual event. Go to the next slide. Before we begin, I just would like to acknowledge that I'm very fortunate to be joining today from the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish, or more specifically, the Lekwungen-speaking peoples here in Victoria, British Columbia. And I'd like to acknowledge that we have people joining today from Indigenous territories from right across Canada. Next slide. Thank you very much for making time to join us for this virtual workshop today. We had nearly 200 people register from right across the country. And I really want to take a moment to allow you to warm up your fingers in our chat box and introduce yourselves, share your name and your organization, and allow you to see who else is joining us today. Great, next slide. Just a little bit of background on CELC. So we are an organization that helps to connect Canada's circular economy community and accelerate the transition. And we do this by serving as a national hub that helps to connect people to the knowledge, the networks, and the opportunities to help achieve circular innovation. We foster constructive dialogue between government and industry on critical issues where collaboration is really key to the system transition that's required to achieve circularity. We help to make the business case for new approaches by shining a light on corporate leadership and circular innovation. And we're helping to accelerate circular transitions in key sectors through, we have 6 different work streams right now focused on advancing the opportunities and trying to tackle some of the barriers here in Canada. And lastly, championing the need for a national circular economy strategy and taking a coordinated approach to advancing sort of the innovation ecosystem that we need here in Canada. So that's really helped set up for today's conversation. If you go to the next slide. And one more. So in 2021, many of you may know that the expert panel on circular economy in Canada at the Council for Canadian Academies released its Turning Point report, which identified the benefits and opportunities, as well as some of the challenges for advancing a circular economy in Canada, and really identified some of the potential economic, the environmental, and the social impacts. And this was a fairly comprehensive report, about 300 pages, but I wanted to just pull out 2 specific quotes here. One is the transition towards a circular economy will help Canada meet its existing policy goals and support Canada's climate agenda, while also enabling economic productivity through more informed and efficient ways of design, production, and consumption. And secondly, they highlighted that developing circular economy roadmaps and strategies at the national or subnational level, as well as for particular sectors or materials, is really key to facilitating a transition towards the circular economy. So that kind of sets up for the work that we've been undertaking for the last little while. And if you go to the next slide, CELC has been collaborating with Smart Prosperity Institute for some work that was commissioned in the fall by Environment Canada to develop a scoping paper that assesses options that Canada may wish to consider in developing a national circular economy approach. So this work to date, if you go to the next slide, has included building on our collective work that we've undertaken, and then adding to that with a scan of international circular economy strategies and approaches, largely within the EU to date, but also looking at a select number of Canadian plans and practices that are not circular economy specific, but maybe some insights that we can share about how to design a strategy or an approach that might work for Canada. And then also conducted more than 20 key informant interviews and have hosted a couple of workshops, this being the second, the first one on the sidelines of the Zero Waste Conference back in September, where we brought a small group together to discuss the opportunities further. So with that in mind, I wanted to introduce Amanda Berry, who is with Environment and Climate Change Canada. She's a senior advisor on the circular economy team. She brings 14 years of experience working in government and recently joined the ECCC's team the strategy policy branch as part of the circular economy group. So just a few words of welcome from Amanda. Over to you, Amanda.
Thanks very much, Paul. Hi, everyone. Many of you may know Leah Canning, who unfortunately was not able to join us today, but is a new member of the ECCC team working on circular economy. I'm very pleased to be joining you and to be part of this workshop. So thank you to all of you for taking this time, and for CELC and the SPI teams for their efforts in organizing this. So I just wanted to provide kind of a few comments on some key milestones that have really helped bring us to this point in our circular economy policy thinking in Canada, to set some of the stage for the conversation. I think it would be really complementary to some of the things that Paul has mentioned. So ECCC has increased its engagement in the circular policy projects or circular economy projects over the last several years, and most notably, building on the outcomes of the Ocean Plastics Charter. The Government of Canada has worked with provinces and territories to develop the Canada-wide strategy on zero plastic waste and advance efforts on circularity in the plastics economy. And now we're taking steps and exploring opportunities to move forward circularity beyond plastics. Environment and Climate Change Canada recognizes that to address the triple environmental crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, that a new way of doing business is needed, and the circular economy provides an economic framework that can help drive this transformational change, while at the same time creating new opportunities economically as we work to eliminate waste and pollution and reimagine how we produce and consume products to keep them in the economy as long as possible and to get as much value as we can out of them. So a big part of how our journey on circular economy and the Government of Canada started was through Canada hosting, for the first time in North America, the World Circular Economy Forum in 2021. We did this in partnership with the Finnish Innovation Fund Sitra, and the event attracted almost 9,000 registrants from over 160 countries across the world. Also, as Paul mentioned, in 2021, the Council of Canadian Academies Turning Point report was really an important milestone, highlighting the needs and opportunities for circular economy in Canada. And I think to add to what he said, some of the key messages are that based on material data flow, Canada right now is not measuring as very circular. Our circularity rate is at 6.1%. And if we were to maintain the sort of business as usual approach, we'll see an increase in material inputs and waste by 40% over the next 20 years. So while we can't pursue circularity for circularity's sake, we also can't lose sight that Canada is among the highest per capita consumers of materials, energy, and water in the world. And there is an imperative to try to address this challenge moving forward, especially in the context of a net zero economy. So one thing that the expert panel also noted that Paul had highlighted is that Canada would really benefit from a nationally coordinated approach to circular economy that's designed to address our unique position and governance within Canada, that we can't just take a cookie cutter approach to some of the other jurisdictions or leading international examples, but that we need a made in Canada approach. So that really brings us to our event today and our work with CELC towards identifying some of the approaches that might work well and bring promising results and outcomes around circularity in Canada. So we look forward to hearing your perspectives, and thanks again for taking valuable time to be with us today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Amanda. A little bit of an intro and a bit of background and the connection there with the federal government's interests in this space. And if we go to the next slide, thought I would just share the objectives again for today's virtual workshop, which are really to share some preliminary findings from the research on the national circular economy approaches that we've taken to date. We'll want to collect really some input really from the diversity of stakeholders that we have on the line here today around what considerations would be important for Canada in terms of the framework or the approach, as well as your thoughts on the success factors, which can include how we set this up from a governance model perspective. And then lastly, this is an important step forward, but we need to really understand who would like to work on the next steps and the key partnerships to advance sort of a made in Canada approach for circular economy. And so we'll give opportunities to get your input on that as well. So if we go to the next slide, just sharing a little bit about today's agenda. And we're going to start things off with Jeff McCarney from the Smart Prosperity Institute, who will share a few insights in terms of helping to set the context of the global trends in circular economy and why it's an important opportunity for Canada. We'll give you a little bit more detail on some of the areas we'll want to consider in terms of the possible circular economy approaches for Canada based on those preliminary insights from our research to date. And then we really want to hear from you. So we'll be spending the bulk of this session in smaller breakout group conversations guided by a set of questions and facilitators in each room to help gather your input and help inform our recommendations. So we'll have about 70 minutes, just over an hour in breakout, and then we'll come back into plenary for the last 15 minutes or so to do a brief reporting out before we wrap up. So maybe just to get a sense of who's on the line today, we put together a couple of polls, and if we could get those up on the screen. Curious to know where people are joining us from today. And what category best describes your organization. So there's two poll questions. We'll get the first one up here and share those results back in just a moment. We have 90 people on the line at the moment, and we're close to 90 results. So if we can share back those results, that would be great. And a mix from across the country, BC, Ontario, a little bit from Alberta and the Prairies, Quebec, and Atlantic provinces. Good to see. And then one more poll here. What category best describes your organization? Just take a moment there. Put a quick on the draw, which is great. Getting close to our full maximum number here. And if we could share that back with the audience. Excellent. So a mixture. We've got companies, we've got local governments, provincial, lots of federal, academia, research, NGO, industry associations. So good, a really nice mix of diversities of perspectives. So looking forward to the insights that we're able to capture from today's session. So with no further ado, I'll introduce Jeff. If we go to the next slide, please. And one more. There we go. So Jeff's an assistant professor of environment and development in the School of International Development and Global Studies, and also the senior director of research at the Smart Prosperity Institute, which is within the University of Ottawa. He oversees the research activities at SPI and a network of over 250 clean economy focused academics and research experts, and a broader global network of about 650 researchers and experts in this space. And in the last 4 years, Jeff and I have worked a lot together, and he's been leading the development of SPI's research program on circular economy in Canada. So he's actually based in France at the moment on parental leave. So happy to have you joining us from Europe, Jeff. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. And who would have thought this is what parental leave looks like? So it's a pleasure to be joining everyone today, and thank you, Paul, for the kind introduction. It's been a pleasure working with Circular Economy Leadership Canada, both on this project and over the years, helping to advance understanding of circular economy in Canada, and also with the support of Environment and Climate Change Canada on a number of different projects, including this one. So I want to do today is a quick overview is what I've been asked to do, and highlight three core ideas. One, a quick background, sort of an intro to circular economy, but taking a bit of a different tack on that, recognizing the overall expertise of people in the room. Secondly, I'm going to then move in a little bit of motivation and thinking around what considerations we might want to give towards a strategy on the circular economy for Canada. And then lastly, speaking a bit to some emerging trends we're seeing and how that might inform a little bit the conversation today. So we've already advanced to the first slide. I thought it was interesting to push this up. The first, I'm stealing this idea from David Hughes, who is the first person I've seen put this up in a presentation, but I think it's really helpful to illustrate just a very simple Google Trends map of how recent the trend in circular economy discussion has been. You really see it's taken off since 2015, and as a discourse and a common framework for these issues, circular economies really emerged just over the last 5 to 7 years. Really from almost a standing start in continuing to move up really rapidly. And what that can do is it can make it seem like we have a common idea and a common frame of reference for what the circular economy is. But if you can advance to the next slide, we've done a lot of work at Smart Prosperity, trying to really understand, well, what are the ideological underpinnings of circular economy? How do we understand it in the literature and as an area of research and as a discourse? And what we find, this is work we did with Institute EDEC a couple of years ago, is it really builds on a number of schools of thought that trace their lineages back much farther back than that graph I just showed you, including industrial ecology, regenerative design, functional economy, cradle to cradle, different ideas like that. And it's related to a number of different topics and issues such as waste management, life cycle assessment, sustainable development, resource efficiency that track and understanding much further back. And I used to use this slide in presentations about a year ago to try to engage people who didn't quite understand the circular economy or didn't see themselves in, to show them that yeah, there actually really is a place for a number of different perspectives and thinking on what circular economy is. Today, I almost use it in the opposite to highlight that, you know, there's more and more people engaging with the topic of circular economy. They're coming at it from different perspectives, and there's a feeling that we have a common understanding of what it means. But a number of different stakeholders in this room and in others really come at it from different backgrounds. And if you look at the other people in the room, and we'll probably find this through the discussions later, there's still different understandings of what it means. And we have work to do to understand how different stakeholders are coming at the topic, the perspectives they bring, and what that means in terms of what they include in the circular economy, how they think the principles apply, how far they think we are along a path to moving forward, and where the challenges are. So it's something to keep in mind. If you want to move to the next slide. That being said, there are, you know, commonly accepted definitions or principles for the circular economy, drawing mainly from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, including designing out waste and pollution, keeping products and materials in use, and regenerating natural systems. Now, those leave a lot of space within them in terms of how they're actually operationalized and implemented. But overall, what we see is, you know, this requires shifts in things like product design, if you want to keep moving forward, business strategy, customer relationships, supply chain management, consumption patterns, and the overall government policies that we need to sort of incentivize and move those ideas along. If you shift to the next slide, in addition to those sort of policy frameworks, there's a lot of focus in circular economy discourses around the circular business models that we think we need to move these practices forward. And this image here is drawn from the CCA report, Canadian Council of Academies report that Paul highlighted earlier, and just frames that, you know, different models included in circular thinking include producing valuable materials from waste, services to support or replace sales, facilitating peer-to-peer asset sharing, repairing, refurbishing, reselling, designing durable products, and overall replacing linear inputs with renewable or recyclable ones. What I want to highlight here is it's important not to get too caught up in the specific examples that are put forward today, because if we'd given this talk 10 years ago, we'd probably really put much less emphasis, probably when we should have been talking more about circular economy, but it hadn't emerged yet. We'd be putting much less emphasis on things like sharing economy, just because that wasn't a technology that was as prominent then. And as we move forward 10 years from now, I think it's uncertain what the real leading business models will be. There'll probably be new innovations that we haven't even thought of yet. And what's important is we get the framing, incentives, and structures right, so that those innovations and new models can emerge and can compete to drive us forward on what a circular economy looks like. If you want to advance. So that being said, shifting sort of kind of the idea of motivation and then a bit of Canadian specific thinking, I think it's useful to highlight that from our perspective anyways, there's really sort of two main drivers for the growing interest in circularity that we see. One is this idea of gauging the level of circularity of our economies. It was mentioned earlier the rate of circularity for Canada from the CELC report. I'm quoting here instead the circularity gap report for 2022 for the globe. The world is only 8.6% circular. Quebec's issued a report where they're lower than this. A number of countries have done the same thing. The overall message from these reports, I think, is that we've got a lot of space to improve. Overall, circularity measures are quite low, suggests we have a lot of distance to cover to improve and move forward. At the same time, if you want to advance, there's a competing message that there's also a really strong opportunity in doing so. This is a quote that's a bit dated now from 2015 from Accenture, but has been used a lot, and it highlights that the circular economy represents a 4.5 trillion revenue opportunity by 2030. And it's good to think about that, and there's a real opportunity here, but it's important to note that that report mainly looked at the revenue opportunity as avoiding losses. It was avoiding supply chain congestions. It was avoiding supply chain disruptions. It was avoiding rapid increase in costs of materials. And that does realize revenue we wouldn't have had, but I also think we need to shift the thinking towards, okay, we need to avoid those constraints, but we also need to think about how this really creates new value and new opportunities as well to broaden the tent and engage a broader range of actors in what a circular economy looks like. If you can advance. And particularly for our discussion today, thinking through what it means from the Canadian perspective, we're starting to see other countries coming up with their own roadmaps and strategies on the circular economy. Paul's going to speak to those a little bit later in our report. But in thinking through a Canadian perspective, we can look along, how you shift linear value chains to circular ones, creating feedback loops, recovering material, keeping material their highest uses is highlighted by this figure. That includes the standard processes like better product designs, improved manufacturing efficiency, recovering of materials, refurbishing manufacturer second use. But we also want to think specifically about where there's key Canadian constraints or opportunities there. Things like getting the challenge presented by our dispersed geography and how we can overcome economies of scale and other challenges in that regard. Ensuring we're being inclusive in the approach to circular economy, thinking particularly about the role of Indigenous stakeholders. And if you've heard me talk about this at all, you'll understand that I tend to point a lot to the left-hand side of this figure, where generally in circular economy discourses, we highlight that primary resource extraction is just something to be minimized and is typically on the outside of the circular economy looking in. And while that's true, we want to minimize extraction of primary resources. There's a broader question here, and it's really essential how we think about Canada's role in transitioning circular economy, given our mining and metals, energy, forestry, and primary resource sectors. If you want to skip ahead, a lot of our work has shown that, if we look at the confluence of mining and metals and energy, we need a significant amount of mining and metals to transition to a low carbon economy. This is summarizing findings from the World Bank, just quoting the amount of materials we're going to need to get to a 2 degrees future. 400 to 500% increases in battery metals, 50 to 200% in for solar, around 50% for a number of rare earths used in wind, and smaller percentage increases in things like aluminum and copper, but those are really large quantity increases if we think about the amount of those bulk metals and minerals we use today. And if we skip ahead, what that means is we're looking at scenarios where this is a projection from the World Bank for aluminum to get to 2 degrees. The top line shows total demand for aluminum emerging over time. The bottom line is displacement of with current reuse, recycling, and recovery rates. And even if we assume that that goes up to 100% recovery and reuse by 2050, we're still only meeting about 61% of demand in 2050, and we actually have increasing demand for primary materials at the same time to meet overall demand projections. So what it suggests is there's really a future emerging where we're going to be trying to figure out how do we align demand for both primary and secondary resources, how do we allocate those across the economy, how do we track and trace these in an effective way, and connect both our primary extractive sectors with emerging innovations and trends downstream. If you want to move ahead. So just a few last thoughts then just on emerging trends. We've done some work working with Circular Economy Leadership Canada and Delphi. This was funded by Global Affairs Canada, just looking at where we see Canadian companies moving towards export opportunities and different emerging global trends driving them. And a few things I just wanted to highlight from that report at a high level. One, looking across a number of sectors, including mining and metals, plastics, bioeconomy, construction, and high tech, we see growing pressure on many of the different companies we looked at to address their overall environmental impact. It's seen as a social license issue, and it's seen as one that's creating pressure across a number of different sectors of the economy. At the same time, we're seeing companies increasingly recognize new economic opportunities and moving beyond the challenges I highlighted earlier around just avoiding losses, and actually how are we creating new value. This ranges from different things we're seeing, like use of electrified mining equipment and emerging sharing and rental markets for equipments in mining. New innovations in mechanical and chemical plastic recycling technologies that Canada is leading in. The development of new technologies to capture byproducts from waste and new regional ecosystems to support that. There's also been strong uptake and interest in bioproducts across a range of sectors, including construction, auto, and packaging, and a real opportunity envisioned for Canada there. And as well, recognizing Canada's leadership in a number of high-tech areas, there's new applications emerging for the high-tech sector to help advance enabling technologies, things like AI, big data, and machine learning to help with sorting, and in new applications to identify efficiencies and new opportunities to move ahead. And the last thing I want to emphasize is that we also hear across a range of partners the importance of industry partnerships, in that given the pressure across different sectors, there's real potential on circular economy for pre-competitive collaboration innovations that companies see benefit in working with each other to improve perspectives of their sectors, as well as competing within their sectors to realize new opportunities. And then the last slide, if you want to advance, so what we hear a lot when we're talking with our partners now are things like, this is responses to a forum we held with the mining sector earlier, but we've heard similar things from other sectors we work on, is that core ideas of where we're going with the circular economy include value, systems thinking, and opportunities. But if you want to click, we also see core areas around less waste, value to waste, zero waste, no waste, you would expect that. Also issues around sustainability and reducing impacts, if you want to keep going. Stewardship ideas and designing for reuse. But the last thing I want to highlight in red is a lot of what we also hear is that there's risk in our sector. It's going to require us to transform. We're unclear of where it's going. And I think this really feeds in well to the discussion we want to have today of how can some broader vision of where we want to go as a Canadian economy and a strategy and a vision for a circular economy help to alleviate those perceptions and unlock more investment in further innovation. So I'll stop there, and thank you for the time.
Thanks, Jeff. Good sort of break the ice in terms of bringing everybody up to speed on some thinking, as well as the Canadian context that will help, I think, have our conversations today about the role of Canada in circular economy, as domestically as well as in the global picture of things. I'm going to provide a few slides shortly on what we've learned from the research so far about approaches and strategies from leading jurisdictions. But before we go there, now that I think we have everybody in the room, we'll do another couple poll questions and check in with people. Here's the question: is your organization actively working to advance a more circular economy at present? Yes, that's what we're focused on in some capacity, but not at mainstream, not at the moment, and not sure. Give that a moment to fill up, and then we can share back the results. I think we're getting close to the full number here. All right, why don't we share back? So pretty even split between companies and organizations that are fairly focused on circular economy, about 46%, and 50% that have it in some capacity but not mainstream, and only a very small percent, 3%, not at the moment. So that's interesting. The last question here, if we can bring that up, is and we should have one more poll. Do you think that Canada needs a national level circular economy plan or strategy? Let's see what we get here. Getting close to our total capacity. All right, slowing right down. Let's share those results. So strong, yes, 82%. And some question marks around the side in terms of it depends or not sure. But no real strong negatives. So interesting results, and should feed well into our next conversation. Thanks very much for sharing that result there on the poll. Why don't we go to the next slide? Okay, and the next slide. So this is a busy slide, and I'm not going to get into all of the detail on it, obviously, but just to say that we've undertaken a comparative scan of some of the approaches to developing circular economy strategies and approaches by leading jurisdictions in Europe, as well as taking a closer look at a leading province in Canada, being Quebec. And I think the European countries you see here, obviously within the European framework, circular economy strategy is considered a key building block of their European Green Deal, which provides a framework and some guidance for its member states. So they're already in some ways working within a framework of policy that supports this. At the national level, much of the efforts that we've seen are being led by ministries of the environment, but in combination with other departments like business or agriculture and forestry and economic development. Finland is the first country in the world to have developed a national circular economy roadmap back in 2016, and they continue to support the global transition to circular economy through a very holistic set of programming and development. In the Netherlands, the government has taken sort of a government-wide approach for their programming and streamlined and coordinated this with their national policy agenda. In Scotland in 2021, they actually appointed the world's first minister of circular economy, and that really created some ownership of the issue. That same ministry's portfolio, interestingly enough, also encompasses green skills and biodiversity. So an interesting angle there. I would say what some of the common areas that we've seen across these sort of approaches is a focus on decoupling economic opportunities from resource consumption. So it's not necessarily from resource extraction, but more from the resource consumption side, and with the focus on keeping things within planetary boundaries. I would say that we've also seen a lot of approaches to really focus on that multi-stakeholder engagement. And thirdly, climate action seems to be a very cross-cutting lens across as a motivator for many of these plans. I would say that many have picked areas that focus in line with their core strengths within those countries, such as forest-based loops in Finland, or the bioeconomy in the Netherlands, or remanufacturing in Scotland, or things like manufacture and even business model innovation in Germany. And the Dutch government, for example, drafted 5 transition agendas that are focused on specific sectors and value chains considered sort of the cornerstones of the Dutch economy, with bio-based solutions cross-cutting all of those. Next slide. So each jurisdiction brings sort of unique perspectives or their own approaches, their own timelines, their own governance models. But I would say that some of the sort of best practices that we've seen is that there's a recognition that transformation to circular economy will take multiple political cycles, that it's a long-term game, that the incentives, the regulatory instruments, the education, research, information tools, access to data, all those pieces are important and are directed at systems change. And for many, the first step was identifying opportunities in the local context, which can then look to different, they can obviously be different by sector or by region, but kind of taking that place-based approach and looking at how to develop strategies around that. And then lastly, sort of the focus that all leading jurisdictions have taken a very inclusive approach to engaging stakeholders, which include interactions with all levels of government, with industry, with NGOs, academia, and right across various sectors and value chains. Next slide. So some of the common motivations are climate action. I mentioned Scotland earlier, they have very integrated circular economy targets in their climate plan, and it's viewed as sort of a key pathway to the country's emission reduction goals. Scotland's 2020 climate change plan had an update basically that includes a vision for a fully circular economy by 2045, driven by a focus on responsible consumption, responsible production, and maximizing the value of waste and energy. Supply chain and resiliency, as well as economic competitiveness, are other key themes that are sort of cross-cutting. In Germany, for example, has a focus on competitiveness and decreasing its reliance on material imports. Job creation and just transition. So Finland, for example, has been incorporating circular economy into curriculum at all levels of its education sector, and they've been promoted sort of a broad understanding of the circular economy model, which is now resulting in sort of the emergence of new skills and training and up-training or upskilling. Trade and investment, Jeff mentioned sort of the opportunities for export. Finland's placed a real emphasis on the opportunities for Finnish circular economy solutions to be exported around the world. And then community and place-based angle. So Scotland, for example, has developed the Cities and Regions program to support opportunities on the ground. Next slide. So it really is different considerations by country. We've seen sort of a top-down approach in Scotland, for example, where they've created sort of a federal framework, a bottom-up approach in Quebec, where we've seen a lot of consultation and academic engagement that have brought that into the provincial government lens. We've seen hybrid models with Finland and the Netherlands, for example, bottom-up, top-down. We've seen industry-led initiatives like the Canada Plastics Pact that are bringing sector roadmaps forward. And I think it's fair to say that many of these leading national strategies often have third-party agencies involved in helping to lead the implementation. So they're arm's length agencies like Citra, the Finnish Innovation Fund, or Zero Waste Scotland, or in Germany, their Circular Economy Initiative Deutschland, or CEID, which has been leading some of their road mapping efforts and the multi-stakeholder approaches. So there's roadmaps, there's these national plans, but there's other forms, right? There's frameworks to consider that could be enabling frameworks. And so really what we want to tease out a little bit with the group of all of you today is what's the right approach for Canada? What are some of the thinking that we could be bringing forward? Next slide. And so in the Canadian context, you know, we have these federal plans like the Emissions Reduction Plan, the Federal Sustainable Development Strategy, sector strategies like the Canada-wide Strategy on Zero Plastic Waste, or the Canadian Minerals and Metals Plan, Forestry, Bioeconomy Framework, etc. We have provincial activities. You know, the Quebec is planning to launch its strategy or roadmap next quarter at the start of 2023. BC is working on a circular economy strategy. Alberta is looking at it from sort of a resource recovery and a plastics opportunity in terms of recycled content and innovation. You know, we're seeing clusters on the ground like the Circular Opportunities Innovation Launchpad in Guelph, or Metal Tech Alley in BC, or CELC Living Labs in Quebec. And we see convening platforms like the Canada Plastics Pact, or the Love Food Hate Waste campaign, or the Circular Cities and Regions initiative. So there's lots of work happening in Canada on the ground, in provinces, at the national level. How do we bring all these pieces together in some sort of a coherent fashion? And what's the right governance model for that? So I'll just leave it with these next couple questions to ponder as we get ready to go into the breakout groups. One is a coordinated national approach to the circular economy needed for Canada, and what value add could that bring to our existing efforts or priorities? And secondly, how could a national approach best be developed and implemented and integrated alongside what we're doing already in Canada, nationally, at sector levels, at provincial levels? So with that in mind, it's time that we get to hear a little bit more from you, and we'll be heading off into breakout group discussions momentarily. But before we do that, just want to cover a few rules of engagement and talk a little bit about how we'll be doing this in our breakout groups. So we have just over about 110 people that are signed on right now, and we are going to be randomly assigning you to about 10 breakout groups in total. Each breakout group will have a facilitator and will be guided by some discussion questions. We've got 4 key discussion questions that we'll use for the next 65, 70 minutes in the breakouts, and we'll work to capture notes and the key takeaways as we sort of have those discussions. So we really invite you to get engaged, to unmute yourselves, to share your insights, your thoughts in line with the guiding questions. If you want to raise your virtual hand, you can do that, but it should be a small enough group that you can at least jump in when you have an opportunity. But feel free to raise your hand, and the facilitator will call on you. Keep your comments brief and to the point if you can, but also specific whenever possible. And feel free to use the chat box if you have links or resources or reports you want to share. We'd ask that you please be respectful of the ideas and the opinions of others, and that you share openly. So feel free to challenge ideas, but not individuals themselves. And we'll use the Chatham House rules where you can use what you've learned throughout this session, but please don't attribute it to individuals or their organizations outside of this workshop. And the facilitators may choose to record the breakout discussions, but for note-taking purposes only, to help them kind of capture the key insights afterwards. And we'll be deleting those portions or those recordings afterwards. So what are we going to be asking, or what are we going to be discussing in those breakout groups? So 4 questions, as I mentioned. First off, what benefits or value add could a nationally coordinated approach to the circular economy bring to Canada, or the work that you're doing more specifically? So the more we can ground this in our reality and not keep it at that theoretical level, the better. So a bit of a discussion on that. Secondly, if Canada were to develop a national circular economy plan or strategy, what should the considerations be in terms of its design? So that can be, you know, the structure, the governance model, those sort of things. Thirdly, we want to know a little bit about what you think the role of the federal government should be in advancing the circular economy in Canada. And lastly, is there sufficient momentum right now for advancing a circular economy strategy at the moment? And if not, why not? And what do we need to do to potentially shift that? Bring the right people on board, etc. So with that, we will be asking our team here on the event side to split us off into breakouts. And as I mentioned, we'll have 10 groups. You'll have a facilitator in each room, and those guiding questions. The facilitators can choose to share those questions up on the screen and take notes as we go, or manage it however they see fit. But really looking forward to the conversations. And we're about 1/4 right now. We will come back at about 20 after, so 65 minutes we'll give everybody. Welcome back, everybody. Give people a moment to settle back in. Hope you had a productive conversation in your breakout rooms. I know we had a good conversation in ours, and certainly lots to cover in just over an hour. And I see some comments in the chat box saying we needed so much more time. So glad to hear it's a productive conversation. And really, this is a starting place. So we do absolutely welcome people to get in touch with us after this session and keep that conversation going. But maybe I'll just go to a couple of our room hosts and facilitators to see if you have a couple thoughts or things that stood out to you as key takeaways. And I'm scanning across my room, and is Sarah Brooks on the line there? Anything you want to share, Sarah?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll just acknowledge the folks that were in the group. Please feel free to jump in with anything that I might miss or misrepresent. But a couple of key things that stood out to me that came about were so first of all, there was a sense that there's the possibility that a national framework could add value to the circularity transition, but that whatever happens at the federal level has to be applicable and capable of being devolved to be deployed at regional, provincial, local levels. And so it can't be so detailed that it stymies things there. So there were some suggestions that perhaps it's a framework, not a roadmap or a strategy. So something to consider about how is it applicable on the ground for folks. And with that in mind, how is it that we ensure that whatever happens as a result of the application of that framework or strategy actually is profitable for people who are trying to run businesses? So that include folks that have boots on the ground, farmers that are working. How do we make sure that people aren't penalized for their livelihoods? And how do we also use any generative tension that arises that might be coming from the circularity transition versus how folks need to and are capable of making a living? How do we use that in a generative way? And then also a real emphasis on the need for the business case, local application, and the capacity for folks. This wasn't said, so team on the line, correct me if I'm wrong, but an underlying theme of how do folks maintain some degree of sovereignty in application. So it's there's nothing that's been force fed. And then of course, also the need to include diverse voices in that transition. So how is it that we ensure that whatever that framework is also is supporting and underpinning a just and inclusive transition to circularity in service of addressing the climate challenge, as well as many of the other things that folks are grappling with day to day.
Great summary. We had some of those similar themes show up in our conversations too, Sarah. Stephanie?
I think in our group, again, please interrupt group if you think I'm misrepresenting, but there was a real focus on just the need to really accelerate awareness of a common understanding of what we mean by circular economy, that there's a lot of confusion. There's actors who are already very much part of the circular economy, but don't see themselves as such. And there's others who are trying to do circular economy, but don't understand what that actually looks like. So both in terms of just really basic education, understanding, awareness, what do we mean by this concept, tools that many sectors, different levels of government, local governments can use. And then we had a really interesting discussion about the need for Canadian relevant metrics that people can start using to really make their work on circularity more rigorous, and to bring some accountability into the conversation on whether we're actually making progress on circularity. And of course, underneath metrics is a whole infrastructure that's needed around how you get to those metrics, what the data availability is, etc. But those two quite strong themes coming out, a sense that there's certainly momentum on circular economy right now, but we really lack the knowledge sharing, experience sharing platforms to learn from the great work that is already underway in the country.
Yeah, very great. Good insights, Stephanie. So it sounds like you had an active group and good conversation. Maybe I'll pick on David Hughes if you're on the line, David.
Sure thing. Well, I'll say first, we had a great group and we had a good diversity of opinions and really great dialogue. I would say a couple of things that came out. One was the importance of having a truly inclusive process that involved all levels of government, industry, SMEs, Indigenous communities, so that whatever process we go through to develop a national strategy, but also just to advance the circular economy, it has to make sure that it's really an inclusive and thoughtful process that involves all aspects of the economy and our kind of social kind of foundations. The second was that general platitudes and broad principles are critical and necessary in any kind of a national strategy, but it's also going to be very, very critical to get down into very specifics, where you're looking at very specific industries and materials where there will be differences. And so to focus down at a very granular level in some cases, and have kind of customized strategies that fit within an overarching set of principles was going to be a critical part of a successful strategy. The kind of coexistence of a longer term process and strategy with short-term pilot projects and tests that allow us to kind of learn as we're doing, but also to make sure there's a longer term trajectory in our thinking. And lastly, with regards to the role of the federal government, it was primarily raised that their primary function can be as a facilitator of a process and as a funder for some of this work. And so those are kind of 4 points that were raised, but it was a great discussion.
Super, thanks, David. Yeah, and maybe time for one more. Go to Marina.
Thanks. I would say that a big message in my group was the fact that we're all kind of building this plane as we're flying it, and that we're still trying to figure out everything all at once, and that government, even within the public service, is trying to figure out what the roles will be, how each department can move circularity forward. And then, of course, at the same time, businesses are struggling with these same questions. So there was a talk about how do we balance the real technical challenges with these policy aspirations? How do we set priorities? And how do we come up with some sort of framework that will clarify how the different strategies that are coming out will work together? So those were the main messages that I would put forward from my group.
Awesome, thanks so much. Why don't we go to the last slide there? We can skip to, and just to say, we have an opportunity to bring all this content together, and we will do that from all the breakout groups. And also people have asked whether we can share the slides from afterwards. So we will make a commitment to share the slides, and we'll put together some form of a high-level takeaways from the breakout group discussions to be able to share back with all the participants here. Environment Canada has also offered to be able to make the scoping study public after the work has been done, which would be at the end of Q1 of next year. So sort of a March timeframe is what we were looking at there. So expect to hopefully be able to review that as well. And just want to say on behalf of CELC and Smart Prosperity Institute, a really big thank you to all of the facilitators and our note takers and all of you as participants for really coming ready to engage as part of our workshop today, providing your insights. I think we really have captured some very useful information to help inform the options that we'll be looking to put forward as part of that scoping study results. And just invite you to stay engaged on the topic. Reach out if you have further thoughts or ideas that you didn't get a chance to share or things come up. And welcome, obviously, to have you suggest others you think we should be engaging or speaking to. And lastly, we do put out a monthly newsletter at CELC that helps to keep you in the loop, pardon the pun, and keep you on top of the latest research and upcoming events and partnership opportunities. And that will be an opportunity where when new reports and things come out, we'll make them available that way too. So go to the last slide, you'll see contact information there for myself and for Jeff. And thank you again for your time today, and really appreciated the input. Wishing you a great rest